The train screeched to a halt, and in a flash a man attacked a young woman, knocking her to the floor while the crowd just stood there, paralyzed. No one moved, no one spoke. The attacker loomed over her, daring someone to intervene. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The red line moaned along its tracks, steel screeching against steel as the city pressed its weight onto the weary commuters inside. The fluorescent lights above flickered with a ghostly hum, casting a pale, washed-out glow over a sea of tired faces. Emily Carter stood near the center of the car, one hand lightly gripping the overhead bar, the other clutching her worn canvas bag. Inside, lesson plans still inked with the day's hopeful scribbles. Her shoulders sagged from exhaustion, but there was a peace about her, a quiet satisfaction only earned from giving more than one has left to give. As the train jolted into the next station, the doors hissed open. Air flooded in, damp, heavy, colder than it should have been. With it came Troy Mitchell, a man whose very presence fractured the rhythm of the car. He entered like a blade slicing through fabric, the tension sharp enough to catch in the throat. His hoodie hung from his frame like molted skin, stained and ripped. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, scanned the passengers not for faces, but for victims. Troy didn't see individuals. He saw obstacles, enemies, reminders of a life that had abandoned him. The endless rejections, the sneers, the sideways glances from people who never knew his name, all of it had curdled into a seething contempt that begged for release. Today, he had decided, he would make someone else feel as small as he had felt all his life. He moved fast, an animal in the moment before it lunges. Emily hardly registered the shove. Her body staggered sideways as Troy ripped the strap of her bag from her shoulder. Reflex overrode reason. She held on. In that heartbeat, a line was crossed. Troy's fist arced through the stale air, connecting with her cheek in a sickening crack that reverberated against the metal walls. The train exhaled a collective gasp, sharp and instinctive, but nobody stepped forward. Time seemed to splinter. Faces blurred into a wall of wide eyes and parted lips, frozen mid-breath. Emily collapsed onto the grimy floor, her hand instinctively covering the growing welt on her face, her mind struggling to process how so quickly safety had evaporated into terror. Troy loomed over her, chest heaving, daring anyone to challenge him. The cold, mechanical voice of the train's intercom droned on, announcing the next stop, oblivious to the rupture in human decency unfolding within its walls. In that frozen tableau, the weight of fear pressed down heavier than the train itself. It was no longer just Emily under attack. It was the entire spirit of the crowd, held hostage by their own inaction. And no one, not yet, was willing to break the spell. Troy stood over Emily like a storm cloud ready to break, his chest rising and falling with shallow, erratic breaths. The sneer carved across his face wasn't just arrogance. It was a dare, a grotesque challenge to the world he despised. His knuckles, still red from the blow, twitched in anticipation, eager for another excuse to lash out. His gaze scanned the train car, daring someone, anyone, to rise against him. No one did. The car seemed to fold in on itself, the air thick with a suffocating silence. Eyes darted away, down to shoes, up to advertisement panels, anywhere but at the wounded woman sprawled on the floor. A man in a tailored navy suit hunched deeper into his seat, tapping furiously at an invisible message on his phone. A teenage boy with earbuds jammed into his ears cranked the volume, the faint thump of bass, a paper-thin barrier against the unfolding nightmare. A mother clutched her daughter, not to shield her, but to shrink into invisibility. Troy thrived in that moment. It wasn't just the purse he had snatched. It was the validation that he could own the space. That fear gave him dominion. Every turned face, Every averted gaze fed the hollow pit inside him, made him feel real for the first time in a long time. Life had kicked him into the gutters, but here, right now, he was king. Emily, her senses still swimming from the impact, pressed trembling fingers to her cheek. The burn of humiliation stung sharper than the bruise swelling under her skin. She blinked back tears, fighting not just the pain, but the rising bile of betrayal. It wasn't Troy's cruelty that shocked her most. It was the abandonment by the world around her. In their refusal to act, the crowd became collaborators in her humiliation. A heat rose inside the train, unseen but palpable. A different kind of fire now burned among the passengers. Not the righteous blaze of courage, but the slow, sickly smolder of shame. Hatred bloomed, wild and unchecked. Hatred for Troy, for his callous brutality. But deeper still, hatred for the ones who should have been her shield, her witnesses, her humanity, and had instead become nothing more than spectators. Emily pushed herself up slowly, every movement sharp with pain. She wobbled but stayed standing, a fragile defiance that, for a second, flickered across the train like a jolt of electricity. Troy watched her with cold amusement, his hands loose at his sides, ready. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit cleared his throat but said nothing. The mother tightened her grip on her daughter, pulling her back as though kindness itself was contagious and dangerous. Fear ruled the car, its invisible fingers gripping throats and rooting feet to the filthy floor. Troy had won, not just by force, but by unraveling the very fabric of their shared humanity. And still, no one moved. From the far end of the train car, something shifted. Not a whisper, not a murmur, but a force breaking free. Jackson Reed moved with purpose, his heavy boots striking the grimy floor like a war drum. At 50 years old, his body bore the scars of 1,000 battles, visible and invisible. The ragged line across his forearm from shrapnel, the haunted shadows beneath his eyes from things no man should have to remember. Yet today, all that weight forged him into something unstoppable. "Hey!" His voice cracked through the stagnant air, deep and commanding, like thunder splitting a storm. The entire car jerked as if slapped awake. Heads whipped around, and for the first time since Troy's attack, the inertia of fear buckled. Troy turned, an ugly grin splitting his face, a sneer full of contempt and mockery. "Mind your business, old man," he spat, his words a careless flick of gasoline onto a waiting fire. But Jackson was already coming, cutting through the field of frozen passengers with terrifying momentum. Years of disciplined violence stirred within him, not blind rage, but a focused, righteous fury sharpened by experience. The instinct to protect, beaten into him by a lifetime of standing between the vulnerable and the vicious, surged into action. Troy, fueled by bravado and adrenaline, swung first. His fist sliced the air, sloppy and desperate. Jackson slipped under it with a predator's precision and answered with a brutal force, slamming Troy sideways against the cold, vibrating wall of the train. The impact was so sudden, so visceral, that the whole car seemed to shudder with it. Troy let out a grunt, all the venom knocked out of him, his body folding under the sheer inevitability of Jackson's assault. Across the aisle, another spark caught flame. Rachel Munoz, barely 5 feet tall and dressed in a worn college hoodie, rose from her seat, hands trembling but determined. Her phone came out, camera flashing to life, capturing everything. Her thumb darted over the emergency call button. In her chest, her heart hammered, not from fear, but from a sudden, blazing sense of duty. Around her, others began to stir, their fear eroding under the pounding reality that the spell of helplessness had been broken. Phones emerged like drawn swords, recording, bearing witness. The bystander paralysis was unraveling thread by thread. Troy thrashed, snarling, but Jackson bore down, one massive arm across Troy's shoulders, pinning him with practiced, relentless pressure. His face, lined and weathered, showed no hatred, only a grim, implacable will to end this. Emily, clutching her battered cheek, lifted her gaze and found Rachel's. In that fleeting, fragile connection, two strangers linked by courage, hope sparked anew. Emily straightened a little, blood pounding in her ears, her body trembling but alive. The tide had turned. The fight for humanity had begun. The screech of the brakes announced the train's arrival at the next station, a jolt that snapped the passengers back into their bodies. Red and blue lights danced against the grime-smeared windows. In a blur of precision and urgency, uniformed officers flooded the platform and stormed the car, their presence a sudden, overwhelming force. Rachel's call had worked. Backup was here. Troy barely had time to curse before two officers seized him, twisting his arms behind his back with a force that brooked no argument. The venom he spat at them was pitiful now, a desperate flailing against the inevitable. His voice cracked, the fire gone, leaving only hollow echoes of a coward unmasked. The crowd parted without hesitation, no longer frozen but electrified with silent, pulsing relief. Passengers stumbled out into the cool station air like survivors dragging themselves from a shipwreck. Some clutched their chests as if they could hold their hearts steady. Others wept openly, tears tracing lines of adrenaline and shame down their faces. Strangers embraced, clinging to one another with a fierce, awkward gratitude. Grateful for survival, grateful for the few who had found the strength to resist when they could not. At the edge of it all, Emily stood upright, battered but unbroken. Her voice trembled as she gave her statement to the officers, recounting the nightmare with a quiet precision. Each word cost her something, but she gave it anyway, because truth mattered. Courage wasn't in feeling no fear. It was in refusing to bow to it. Jackson hovered nearby, his broad frame a silent sentinel. When an officer clapped him on the back and called him a hero, Jackson merely shrugged, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. "Just did what had to be done," he muttered. And when he squeezed Emily's shoulder in brief, rough solidarity, it carried more comfort than 100 empty platitudes. That night, the world bore witness. Rachel's footage ignited across social media like wildfire, but it wasn't framed as another story of senseless violence. It was a narrative of resistance, of humanity reclaiming itself. Clips looped endlessly, Jackson stepping forward, Emily rising from the floor, phones raised not in voyeurism but in defiance. A collective moment when fear lost its chokehold, when decency fought back. Headlines crowned Jackson a hero, but he didn't care for the title. Glory wasn't the reward he sought. His satisfaction was quieter, deeper, seeing a woman who had been struck down rise again, knowing that, for once, evil hadn't been allowed to slink away into the night unchallenged. And for everyone packed into that battered red line car, something fundamental had shifted. The memory of this day would burn into them, a truth no one could unsee. Courage is contagious. So is silence. And maybe, just maybe, next time the scales tipped toward fear, someone else would find the fire to stand. Maybe not just one, maybe a whole train.